At 11:32 on the morning of December 20th, 1943, Second Lieutenant Charlie Brown gripped the controls of his B-17 flying fortress high above Bremen, Germany, as the sky erupted around him. Below the formation, more than 250 German anti-aircraft guns opened fire at once. Black flak bursts exploded in the cold winter air, filling the sky with lethal fragments. Charlie Brown was 21 years old. He had 0 combat missions completed. This was his first. The German gunners waiting for the American bombers that morning were not ordinary soldiers. Many were officer candidate trainees, some of the best marksmen the Luftwaffe had available. They had spent hours preparing their guns, calculating altitude, and waiting for the bombers to arrive. Now the Americans had flown straight into their sights. Brown's bomber carried a name painted proudly beneath the cockpit windows. Ye Old Pub. Inside the aircraft were 10 crewmen and 6,000 pounds of bombs. Their target was a Focke-Wulf FW-190 fighter aircraft factory on the outskirts of Bremen. At the morning briefing, intelligence officers had warned the crews that they might encounter hundreds of German fighters. What they did not mention was something else, something far more dangerous: the position assigned to Brown's aircraft. In a B-17 formation, not every position was equal. The bombers flew in a defensive pattern called a combat box, designed so that the machine guns of each aircraft overlapped with the others, creating a deadly web of defensive fire. But there were gaps, and the most dangerous of those gaps was located along the outer edge of the formation. The men of the 379th Bombardment Group had a name for that position: Purple Heart Corner. It was the spot where German fighters almost always attacked first. The defensive guns from neighboring bombers could not fully protect it, and new crews were often assigned there. Charlie Brown's crew was the newest of all. Before Ye Old Pub could even reach the target, disaster struck. A 20mm cannon shell exploded directly in front of the cockpit. The blast shattered the bomber's plexiglass nose. At 27,000 feet, the temperature outside was nearly 60 degrees below zero. Air screamed into the aircraft at over 150 miles per hour. Almost instantly, the number 2 engine died. The number 4 engine began overspeeding, forcing Brown to throttle it back to prevent catastrophic failure. The bomber slowed. Within seconds, the rest of the formation pulled ahead. Ye Old Pub was alone. German fighter pilots saw it immediately. A swarm of Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s dropped toward the crippled bomber like wolves descending on wounded prey. The attack lasted more than 10 minutes. Cannon shells tore through the bomber's aluminum skin. Machine gun bullets ripped across the wings and fuselage. The number 3 engine was hit and dropped to half power. The oxygen system ruptured. Hydraulic lines burst. The electrical system failed. The tail section was shredded by cannon fire. Then tragedy struck inside the bomber. Sergeant Hugh Eckenrode, the tail gunner, took a direct hit from a 20mm shell. He was killed instantly. Around the aircraft, chaos spread. Most of the remaining crew members were wounded. Charlie Brown himself was struck by a fragment that tore into his right shoulder. The extreme cold had frozen the oil in many of the bomber's defensive guns. Of the 11 machine guns mounted on the aircraft, only 3 were still working. And then something even worse happened. The oxygen system finally failed. At 27,000 feet, the human brain cannot survive long without oxygen. Brown felt his vision narrowing. Darkness crept in from the edges of his sight. His hands grew numb on the controls. Beside him, his co-pilot Spencer Luke had already slumped forward, unconscious. Charlie Brown's final thought before everything went black was simple. His crew was about to die on their very first mission. With no one controlling it, Ye Old Pub began to fall. The massive bomber dropped from the sky in an uncontrolled dive. The airspeed climbed past 300 miles per hour. The airframe shuddered violently. At any moment the wings could tear away from the fuselage. But then something happened that should not have been possible. At roughly 1,000 feet above the ground, Brown regained consciousness. The thicker air at lower altitude carried enough oxygen to revive him. Instinct took over. He grabbed the controls and pulled back with everything he had left. The B-17 leveled out just above the treetops of northern Germany. Brown looked around the cockpit. Blood everywhere. Wounded men everywhere. His tail gunner was dead. His aircraft was shattered. And he had just flown directly over a German fighter airfield. On that airfield, A Luftwaffe pilot named Franz Stigler was refueling his Messerschmitt Bf 109. He had already shot down 2 American bombers that morning. One more victory would earn him the Knight's Cross, one of Germany's highest military decorations. Stigler looked up and saw something strange. A crippled B-17 limping across the sky at barely 100 feet above the ground. Franz Stigler climbed into his fighter. The engine roared to life. Within minutes, he was airborne and closing rapidly on the wounded bomber. He positioned his aircraft behind the B-17's tail. His finger rested on the trigger. One squeeze. That was all it would take. The Knight's Cross would be his. But what Franz Stigler saw through his gun sight would change everything he believed about war, about honor, and about the enemy he had been taught to hate. The German fighter slid closer. Franz Stigler eased his Messerschmitt Bf 109 alongside the shattered cockpit of the B-17. For a moment, the 2 aircraft flew so close that the pilots could see each other clearly through the broken glass. Inside the bomber, Charlie Brown stared back. His face was streaked with blood. The wind roared through the destroyed nose of the aircraft. Brown's eyes were wide with exhaustion and fear. He was certain that the German pilot was about to fire. Instead, something unexpected happened. Stigler raised his hand. Then he pointed down toward the ground. He was trying to signal the American pilot. Land the aircraft. Surrender. It was the only way the crew might survive. But Brown didn't understand. To him, the gesture looked like an order to go down. To crash. To die. He shook his head. Stigler tried again. This time he pointed north. Towards Sweden, neutral territory. If the Americans could reach Sweden, they would be interned for the rest of the war, but they would live. Medical care would be waiting. The wounded would survive. But once again Brown didn't understand. He kept flying west. Toward England. Toward the North Sea. Nearly 250 miles of freezing water in a bomber that was barely staying in the air. Franz Stigler realized he had only one option left. And it was an option that could cost him his life. If he allowed the American bomber to escape, the Luftwaffe could accuse him of treason. A German pilot who knowingly spared an enemy aircraft could face court-martial. If convicted, the punishment could be death by firing squad. Stigler understood the risk perfectly. He made the decision anyway. He would not simply spare the bomber. He would escort it to safety. Stigler moved his fighter into formation on the left wing of the B-17. He flew so close that the distance between the aircraft was measured in feet. From the ground, the 2 silhouettes would appear almost merged into a single shape. That was exactly what Stigler wanted. German anti-aircraft crews below were trained to recognize aircraft silhouettes. If they saw a German fighter flying beside a bomber, they might assume it was one of the captured B-17s the Luftwaffe occasionally used for training and deception missions. If they believed the aircraft was friendly, they would hold their fire. It was a desperate gamble, but it was the Americans' only chance. Inside Ye Old Pub, Charlie Brown watched the German fighter take position beside his wing. His heart pounded. He had ordered his top turret gunner, Bertie Colomb, to track the German fighter but not fire. Brown still didn't understand what was happening. Was the German pilot toying with them, calling reinforcements, leading them into a trap? Minute after minute passed. The B-17 limped westward, and the German fighter stayed beside them. They passed over German farmland. They passed over small villages. They crossed roads filled with military vehicles. At any moment someone on the ground could look up and see them. At any moment a flak battery could open fire. At any moment another German fighter could appear and demand to know why Franz Stigler was flying beside an enemy bomber instead of destroying it. But the minutes kept passing, and Stigler stayed with them. Finally the coastline appeared. Ahead lay the gray waters of the North Sea. 250 miles of freezing ocean between Germany and England. If the bomber could cross that distance, the crew might survive. If the engines failed over the water, they would die. But first they had to pass the coastal defenses. The German Atlantic Wall stretched along the entire coastline. Radar stations, observation posts, heavy anti-aircraft batteries. Every aircraft crossing the coast was tracked and identified. A damaged American bomber flying low and slow would normally be an easy target. But Stigler stayed in position. He flew so close to the bomber that his wingtip nearly touched the B-17's fuselage. If the flak gunners fired at the bomber, they would hit him too. The gamble worked. The coastal batteries did not fire. Radar operators tracked 2 aircraft flying together and assumed they were friendly. Ye Old Pub crossed the German coastline unchallenged. Franz Stigler had done the impossible. He had escorted an enemy bomber through one of the most heavily defended airspaces in Europe. He had saved 9 American lives, but he could not follow them any farther. His fighter's radiator was damaged. Fuel was running low, and if he flew all the way to England, he would spend the rest of the war as a prisoner. He had to turn back. Stigler pulled his fighter alongside the B-17 cockpit one last time. Charlie Brown looked at him through the shattered window. For a brief moment, the two men locked eyes. 2 young pilots, from opposite sides of a brutal war, separated by only a few feet of freezing air. Stigler lifted his hand and saluted. Then he banked his fighter away and disappeared into the gray winter sky. Charlie Brown watched the German aircraft fade into the distance. He still didn't understand what had happened. He didn't know the German pilot's name. He didn't know why he had been spared. He only knew that a man who should have killed him had chosen not to. But Brown's ordeal was far from over. He was now 250 miles from England in a bomber that was barely flying. 3 engines were damaged. The 4th was unreliable. The hydraulic system was destroyed. The radio barely worked. 1 crewman was dead. 6 more were wounded. And the freezing North Sea waited below. Charlie Brown brought Ye Old Pub down onto the runway in what could only be described as a controlled crash. The B-17 touched the tarmac hard. The damaged landing gear collapsed almost instantly. The bomber slammed onto its belly and skidded down the runway in a long shower of sparks, metal screaming against concrete. For several seconds, the aircraft slid uncontrollably. Then, finally, it stopped. Inside the cockpit, Charlie Brown didn't move. His hands were still locked around the controls. His entire body trembled from exhaustion and shock. But he had done it. He had brought his crew home. 8 men climbed out of Ye Old Pub alive. 1 was carried out dead. The aircraft itself was finished. The damage was too severe to repair. Later, the bomber would be shipped back to the United States and eventually sold for scrap metal. But that day, the focus was on the crew. They had survived. During the intelligence debriefing, Brown told the officers everything. He described the German fighter that had appeared behind them. He explained how the pilot had flown alongside the bomber instead of attacking. He described the moment when the German pilot saluted before turning away. The intelligence officers listened carefully. When Brown finished, they gave him a direct order. He was never to speak of this incident again. The story was classified. The United States military did not want a story circulating about a German pilot showing mercy to an American bomber crew. It could create sympathy for the enemy. Brown obeyed the order. For decades, he kept the secret. Meanwhile, about 300 miles away, Franz Stigler landed his damaged Bf-109 at his airfield near Bremen. He told no one what he had done. If the Luftwaffe discovered that he had deliberately allowed an American bomber to escape, the consequences could be fatal. A court-martial would almost certainly follow, and the punishment could be execution. So Stigler kept his silence. 2 men, on opposite sides of the war, each carrying a story they could never tell, each wondering if the other had survived. The secret lasted more than 4 decades. The war ended in May 1945. Charlie Brown returned home to West Virginia. He finished college and later rejoined the newly formed United States Air Force in 1949. He worked in intelligence and eventually retired in 1972 as a lieutenant colonel. Later, he settled in Miami, Florida, where he started a small business in combustion research. Franz Stigler's life took a very different path. Germany was devastated after the war. The Luftwaffe no longer existed. During the final months of the war, Stigler had flown the revolutionary Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. But even that advanced aircraft could not prevent Germany's defeat. After the war, Stigler struggled to rebuild his life. In 1953, he immigrated to Canada, settling in Vancouver, British Columbia. There he built a successful business and slowly began a new life. Yet neither man ever forgot December 20th, 1943. Charlie Brown often wondered about the German pilot who had spared his crew. Who was he? Why had he shown mercy? Had he survived the war? But Brown had been ordered to remain silent. And for decades, he obeyed. Franz Stigler also wondered about the American bomber. Did it make it across the North Sea? Did the crew survive their wounds? Had his decision mattered? He had no way to know, and no one he could ask. 43 years passed. Then in 1986, Charlie Brown attended a military aviation event known as the Gathering of Eagles at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama. During the event, someone asked if he had any memorable combat stories. For the first time in over 40 years, Brown told the story. He described the shattered bomber. He described the German fighter that appeared beside his wing. And he described the salute. The audience sat in stunned silence. When the talk ended, something changed inside Brown. He realized he had to find the man who had spared his life. He had to thank him. The search began. Brown contacted the U.S. Air Force Archives. Nothing. He contacted the West German Air Force. No records. He wrote letters to historians across Europe. No answers. Months became years. Every lead ended in silence. The German pilot seemed lost to history. By 1989, Brown was running out of hope. Friends told him to give up. Even if the pilot had survived the war, finding one man among millions of German veterans would be nearly impossible. But Brown refused to quit. He wrote one final letter. This time he sent it to a newsletter for former Luftwaffe pilots called Jägerblatt. In the letter he described the encounter, the date, the location, the type of aircraft. He asked if anyone knew who the German pilot might have been. The letter was published in early 1990. Weeks later, Charlie Brown received a response. The envelope had a Canadian postmark. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The letter began with 3 simple words. I was the one. Franz Stigler had read the newsletter. He recognized the story immediately. For 46 years, he had wondered if the bomber survived. Now he finally had his answer. The Americans had made it home. Brown read the letter with tears running down his face. Every detail matched his memory. The escort, the damaged bomber, the salute. There was no doubt. This was the man who had saved his life. Brown called directory assistants in Vancouver, Canada. He asked if they had a number for Franz Stigler. They did. With trembling hands, Brown dialed the number. A voice answered. An elderly man with a German accent. Brown introduced himself. There was a long pause. Then Franz Stigler began to cry. The 2 men talked for hours. Astonishingly, they discovered something else. For years they had lived less than 200 miles apart. Stigler in Vancouver. Brown for a time in Seattle before moving to Miami. They had been neighbors without ever knowing it. They arranged to meet that summer in Florida. When Charlie Brown entered the hotel lobby, he was 67 years old. His hair had turned gray, but his heart was pounding like he was 21 again. Franz Stigler was already waiting. He was 74 years old. The same eyes that had looked across at Brown through the shattered cockpit window were still there. For a moment, neither man moved. 46 years of silence hung in the air between them. Then they walked toward each other and embraced. A friend recorded the moment on video. 2 old men holding each other and crying, neither wanting to let go. Brown had brought photographs, pictures of his children, pictures of his grandchildren. 3 generations of a family that existed because Franz Stigler had lifted his finger from the trigger in 1943. Stigler looked at the photos through tears. He had never received the Knight's Cross. He had never been celebrated for his combat victories. But standing there in that hotel lobby, looking at the lives his mercy had created, he realized he had received something far greater than any medal. 3 months later, Brown and Stigler attended a reunion of the 379th Bomb Group in Massachusetts. The American veterans invited Stigler as their guest of honor. 2 surviving crew members from Ye Olde Pub were there. Sam Blackford, the ball turret gunner whose feet had nearly frozen during the flight home. Richard Petchow, the radio operator wounded in the attack. Both had lived full lives. Both had families. They embraced Stigler with tears and laughter. They thanked him for the decades he had given them. When the room filled with their families, someone counted the people present. 25 lives existed because one German pilot had chosen not to pull the trigger. That day, the men of the 379th Bomb Group made Franz Stigler an honorary member of their unit. A former enemy, now a brother, a German fighter ace, officially welcomed into an American bomber unit. Former enemies, now brothers. When the story finally became public, it spread quickly. Newspapers picked it up. Television stations requested interviews. Air museums and military organizations invited Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler to speak. Whenever possible, the 2 men traveled together. The American bomber pilot and the German fighter ace stood side by side in front of audiences who had never heard a story like theirs. Veterans often sat silently in the crowd, wiping tears from their eyes. Young people approached them afterward to shake their hands. Many said the same thing. Their story restored something people thought war had destroyed forever: faith in humanity. Not long after their reunion, Stigler gave Brown a gift. It was a book about German fighter aircraft. Inside the front cover, he had written a message. Stigler explained that in 1940 he had lost his only brother in the war. Then he wrote that on December 20th, 1943, 4 days before Christmas, he had been given the chance to save the crew of a B-17 bomber. He wrote that the pilot of that aircraft, Charlie Brown, had become as precious to him as his own brother had once been. At the bottom of the page, he signed the note with 2 simple words: "Your brother." From that moment forward, Brown and Stigler were more than friends. They were family. They spoke on the phone nearly every week. They visited each other's homes. They went fishing together. They celebrated holidays together. Their bond was deeper than either man had expected to find again after the war. Their story reached audiences around the world. Letters poured in from strangers. Some said the story moved them to tears. Others said it reminded them that compassion can survive even in the darkest moments of history. But for Charlie Brown, something still felt unfinished. The crew of Ye Olde Pub had never received official recognition for what they endured that day over Bremen. The mission had been classified for decades. Their ordeal had quietly disappeared from the official record. Brown decided to change that. He began writing letters to the United States Air Force. He asked them to review the events of December 20th, 1943. He wanted his crew to receive the recognition they deserved. The Air Force opened an investigation. Old wartime records were examined. Mission reports were studied. Witness testimony was reviewed. Finally, in 2008, the United States Air Force completed its findings. Everything Charlie Brown had described was confirmed. The bombing mission to Bremen. The devastating attack by German fighters. The death of tail gunner Hugh Eckenrode. The wounded crew struggling to keep their aircraft in the air. The incredible flight across the freezing North Sea. And the German fighter pilot who had chosen mercy instead of victory. The Air Force made a historic decision. Each surviving member of the Ye Olde Pub crew would receive the Silver Star, one of the highest awards for valor in combat. For the crew members who had already passed away, the medals would be awarded posthumously to their families. 9 Silver Stars. For one bomber crew. It was unprecedented. But the honors did not stop there. Charlie Brown himself would receive the Air Force Cross, the second highest military decoration awarded for extraordinary heroism. No other World War II bomber crew had ever been collectively honored in such a way. 65 years after their mission, the men of Ye Olde Pub finally received the recognition they deserved. The ceremony was solemn and emotional. Surviving crew members attended with their families. Children and grandchildren of the fallen stood proudly as medals were presented in honor of fathers and grandfathers they had never met. Charlie Brown was there. He was 85 years old. His body was frail, but his spirit was strong. And standing beside him, just as he had stood for nearly 2 decades, was Franz Stigler. Stigler had already received recognition of his own. In 1993, the Combatants for Peace Federation of Europe awarded him the Star of Peace. The award honored soldiers who demonstrated exceptional humanity during wartime. Only a handful of German veterans ever received it. But Stigler always insisted that he did not deserve special praise. He said he had simply done what any honorable man should do. He had refused to kill defenseless men. He had followed a code that valued human life over military glory. He had answered what he called a higher call. Their story continued to reach new audiences. Journalists wrote articles. Television documentaries were produced. In 2012, author Adam Makos published a book about their story titled A Higher Call. Makos spent years interviewing both men, visiting the locations where the events took place, and researching military archives in the United States and Germany. The book became a New York Times bestseller. Readers were captivated by the story of 2 enemies who became brothers. In 2014, the Swedish band Sabaton released a song inspired by the incident. They called it No Bullets Fly. The song introduced the story to an entirely new generation. Young listeners across the world discovered the German pilot who refused to shoot, and the American pilot who spent 46 years searching for him. In 2019, a restored B-17 Flying Fortress operated by the Erickson Aircraft Collection in Oregon was repainted in the colors and markings of Ye Olde Pub. The aircraft began flying at air shows across the United States. Every time it took to the sky, it carried the memory of that mission in 1943. By 2008, however, time was catching up with the two men. Stigler was 92 years old. Brown was 87. They had been given 18 years of friendship since their reunion. 18 years of phone calls. 18 years of visits. 18 years they never expected to have. Franz Stigler died on March 22, 2008 in Vancouver, Canada. He was 92 years old. Charlie Brown received the news in Florida. The man who had once been his enemy and later became his brother was gone. Yet Brown felt peace. Stigler had lived long enough to know the truth. The bomber had made it home. The crew had survived. His decision over Germany in 1943 had mattered. 8 months later, on November 24, 2008, Charlie Brown also passed away. He was 87 years old. The two men who met as enemies in the skies of war had died in the same year, only months apart. It was almost as if neither wished to remain long in a world without the other. But their legacy continues. The book A Higher Call continues to introduce new readers to their story. The song No Bullets Fly carries their names to millions of listeners. The restored Old Pub still flies at air shows, reminding new generations of what happened that winter morning in 1943. Yet perhaps the most powerful legacy is the simplest one. The families, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, dozens of lives that exist because one German fighter pilot chose not to pull the trigger. Franz Stigler once wrote a note to Charlie Brown that captured everything he felt. He explained that he had lost his only brother in the war. He wrote that on December 20th, 1943, he had been given the chance to save a B-17 bomber. And he wrote that Charlie Brown had become as precious to him as his brother had been. He signed the note, "Your brother, Franz." The story of Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler is not simply a story about war. It is a story about what survives after war ends. It is a story about honor that rises above nationality. A story about mercy that echoes across generations. Two young men met in the sky over Germany. One had every reason to kill. The other had no chance to survive. And in that moment, something extraordinary happened. Franz Stigler answered a higher call. And Charlie Brown spent the rest of his life grateful that he did.